First, Adam Lanza, 20, was the embodiment of extreme withdrawal. A young man who lived almost entirely cut off from the world around him. The home he grew up in lacked nothing in terms of comfort, yet it lacked connection. In the final years of his life, Lanza spent most of his time inside a closed-off bedroom, where the computer screen became his only escape. He immersed himself in online spaces filled with documents, articles, and information about past mass shootings. This obsession didn't surface through words or clear actions, but it slowly became the center of his isolated existence. Adam's psychological history was a long chain of instability, from anxiety to emotional disorders that pushed him further and further away from others. He did not make friends, did not communicate, and rarely appeared in front of strangers. Even with his mother, Nancy Lanza, the relationship was marked by distance. They lived under the same roof, but seldom spoke face to face. Short email exchanges were sometimes the only way they communicated, as if spoken words had become too heavy a burden. Nancy tried to care for Adam and provide him with stability, but there was always an invisible wall between them, quietly growing taller over time. For years, Adam Lanza lived in a state of near total isolation. He withdrew from friends, from school, and from every form of social activity, to the point that his presence gradually faded even within his own home. He was rarely seen outside, and even inside the house, Adam kept himself shut away in a darkened room, cutting off nearly all direct contact. This prolonged isolation wasn't just a habit, it was a clear sign of a life slowly slipping out of its normal orbit. At the same time, Adam spent hours in front of his computer, downloading and storing an enormous amount of material related to past mass shootings. From investigative reports and crime scene images to behavioral analyses of perpetrators, he collected it all in a systematic way. This archive didn't reflect momentary curiosity. It was a quiet but persistent obsession that grew deeper over time. Despite these patterns unfolding over many years, the mental health systems Adam had interacted with never intervened strongly enough to halt his silent decline. Infrequent therapy sessions, incomplete evaluations, and weak coordination between his family, school, and mental health professionals allowed him to slip further into his own world. The gaps in support unnoticed at the time formed a warning picture that, in hindsight, had been clearly there but tragically overlooked. Within the Lanza household, a series of events unfolded that no one could have foreseen. After years of living in his own isolated world, Adam Lanza turned a gun on the one person who had remained closest to him, his mother, Nancy Lanza. Killing her inside their home was not only the first step in his plan, but also the final severing of the few fragile ties that still connected him to the real world. He then took her car and drove straight to Sandy Hook Elementary School, the same school he had attended as a child. In a haunting twist, he chose to return to a place tied to his early memories, but this time with destructive intent. Arriving around 9:35 a.m., Adam entered the school in a detached, emotionless state. Within just a few minutes, the tragedy that unfolded shook the entire nation. 20 young students and 6 school staff members lost their lives. A space meant to be peaceful, a place where children began their morning with familiar routines, was suddenly turned into the scene of an unimaginable catastrophe. The incident happened so rapidly that first responders could only attempt to reach the area amid chaos. As alarms sounded and police rushed into the building, Adam Lanza ended the attack by taking his own life, leaving behind countless unanswered questions. Though the violence lasted only a single morning, its impact reverberated across the United States and continued to weigh heavily on the Newtown community for years. Those brief moments forever altered history, making the name Sandy Hook synonymous with one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in modern American memory. Looking back at the broader context before the tragedy, it becomes clear that gaps within multiple systems contributed to what happened at Sandy Hook. For years, Adam Lanza lived in a state of extreme isolation, nearly detached from all social interaction. Yet the severity of his withdrawal was never fully assessed by any agency or professional organization. The signs of his long-term psychological decline, from cutting off communication to confining himself to his room, were not treated as potential risks, resulting in a lack of strong, sustained intervention. Additionally, firearm management within the Lanza household revealed a significant weakness. All of the weapons used had been legally purchased by his mother, yet they were not stored in a way that prevented Adam from accessing them. This lack of secure storage allowed him to obtain the firearms and carry out his plan without encountering meaningful barriers. These two factors, a prolonged, unmonitored psychological decline and a home environment with unsecured firearms, combined to form a dangerous gap that went unnoticed until it was too late. The tragedy at Sandy Hook left not only profound grief within the local community, but also sent shockwaves across the United States. In the aftermath, national discussions about school safety, mental health, and gun control intensified more than ever before. Schools throughout the country began reassessing their student protection procedures, from access control to emergency response training. At the same time, advocacy organizations such as Sandy Hook Promise were established, aiming to raise public awareness and develop educational programs designed to prevent similar tragedies. The case also motivated lawmakers to re-examine gaps in the gun control system, even as the debate remained highly contentious. Despite the passage of time, the impact of Sandy Hook is still deeply felt, serving as a lasting reminder of the importance of protecting children in an increasingly complex and uncertain society. The second individual, Seung-Hui Cho, the perpetrator in the Virginia Tech shooting, was a student whose quiet demeanor made it nearly impossible for others to read what he was thinking. From a young age, Cho struggled with severe depression and anxiety disorders, conditions that left him almost silent in most social interactions. Classmates rarely heard him complete a full sentence. When he was required to speak, his voice came out as a faint, hesitant whisper, leading many to believe he was deliberately avoiding them. Over time, his limited use of language became an invisible barrier that prevented him from connecting with the world around him. In the university environment, where relationships and social engagement are essential, Cho became even more withdrawn. He moved quietly through the vast campus, blending into the crowd without drawing attention. Though outwardly unremarkable, he was engaged in a constant internal psychological struggle. His depression caused him to retreat inward, while his anxiety made every conversation feel like a daunting confrontation. Those who had close interactions with him described his face as showing little emotion, with distant eyes that rarely made direct contact. Notably, years before he became a college student, a court had determined that Cho posed a danger to himself and required treatment. However, the documentation, referral, and follow-up processes were lost within a complex administrative system. The court's decision, potentially crucial in ensuring ongoing monitoring and support, was never properly recorded, allowing Cho to continue living in isolation and worsening mental distress without anyone fully recognizing the severity of his condition. Before the tragedy occurred, clear warning signs about Seung-Hui Cho's psychological condition had already surfaced within the school environment. In his creative writing classes, Cho submitted essays filled with dark and violent themes, so troubling that his professor reported them to the university. These writings were not merely artistic experimentation, but reflected a deeply distressed inner world. Instructors described his work as carrying suppressed anger and fragmented thoughts, as if he were using writing to express a despair he could not articulate verbally. Outside the classroom, Cho continued to isolate himself to an extreme degree. He limited communication so much that friends, classmates, and even his roommates struggled to understand his emotional state. The therapy sessions arranged by the university were initially seen as an opportunity to support him, but Cho did not engage, did not open up, and eventually stopped maintaining contact with mental health professionals altogether. This quiet resistance made every attempt to help him stall, while his mental state continued to deteriorate. Another crucial warning lay in Cho's psychiatric history. Years earlier, a court had ruled that he required treatment because he posed a risk to himself. According to regulations, such information should have been entered into the background check system to prevent access to dangerous tools. However, due to inconsistent administrative procedures and a lack of data coordination between agencies, Cho's record was never updated. As a result, he remained in a monitoring gap, where the most important warnings went unnoticed by everyone. On the morning of the 16th of April 2007, the Virginia Tech campus began like any other spring day, but within just a few short hours, it became the center of one of the most devastating tragedies in American history. Shortly after 7 a.m., Seung-Hui Cho entered the West Ambler Johnston dormitory, a place where he had once lived like any other student, and there he took the lives of two individuals. The act happened so quickly and quietly that many people in the building had no idea a tragedy was unfolding. After leaving the dorm, Cho returned to his own room. There, he took a calculated and unusual step. He mailed a package to NBC News. Inside were videos, photographs, and a manifesto-like statement indicating that Cho had spent significant time preparing and wanted to leave behind a record of his intentions before carrying out the next phase of his plan. The package was sent in the interval between the two attacks, highlighting the deliberateness and emotional detachment with which he acted. A little more than 2 hours after the dormitory incident, Cho appeared at Norris Hall, an academic building crowded with morning classes. Deliberately, he chained the doors shut to slow outside access and sow confusion inside. When the first sounds echoed through the halls, students and faculty had little time to understand what was happening before the situation became critical. In just a matter of minutes, Cho caused dozens of casualties, turning Norris Hall into the focal point of a wave of fear that swept across the campus. As police forces reached the building and prepared to enter, Cho chose to end the situation by taking his own life. The entirety of the events from the first incident in the dormitory to the conclusion at Norris Hall unfolded within a single morning, yet the impact lasted for years. His actions left the nation in shock and raised countless unresolved questions about motive, mental health, and the hidden struggles of a student who had seemed almost invisible within the crowd. The Virginia Tech incident exposed several critical gaps in information management and threat response systems. One of the most significant failures was that Seung-Hui Cho's mental health record, despite a court ruling that he required mandatory treatment, was never entered into the national database. As a result, authorities were unable to restrict his access to firearms, creating a troubling legal gap. In addition, on the morning of the incident, information about the first two victims in the dormitory was not communicated promptly or clearly to the entire campus, leaving many students and faculty unaware of the ongoing danger. Internal departments within the university also lacked effective coordination, leading to slow and inconsistent assessments of the developing situation. Together, these factors formed a chain of systemic shortcomings that prevented crucial warnings from being acted upon at the right time. The Virginia Tech tragedy became a major turning point in national awareness regarding campus security and student mental health. In its aftermath, universities across the United States reevaluated their emergency alert procedures, leading to the widespread adoption of text, email, and public address notification systems to ensure that critical information could be delivered instantly during a crisis. The incident also prompted significant changes to the federal background check system, particularly in how mental health records were updated and shared to prevent high-risk individuals from accessing firearms. At the same time, discussions about mental health in educational settings broadened, encouraging the development of early intervention programs and additional support for students in distress. From a deeply painful tragedy, Virginia Tech became a catalyst for the nation to confront systemic shortcomings and work toward improving safety within academic communities. Nicholas Cruz, the perpetrator in the 2018 shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, was a 9-year-old with a deeply troubled history marked by psychological struggles and family instability. Adopted as a child, Cruz's parents tried to provide a stable foundation, yet emotional difficulties appeared early in his life. The death of his father when he was 6 was a significant shock, and in 2017, when his adoptive mother also passed away, Cruz was left feeling almost entirely unanchored. Losing the person he depended on most, he moved in with family, friends, but the change could not fill the long-standing emotional void. In school, Cruz frequently displayed violent behavior, irritability, and difficulty regulating his emotions. Teachers described him as a student who reacted intensely when reprimanded, while classmates sensed instability in his expressions and speech. These behaviors led to repeated disciplinary actions and ultimately his expulsion from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, where he had studied for many years. Being separated from a familiar environment only deepened his sense of isolation and hostility. Beyond his psychological struggles, Cruz harbored a strong fixation on weapons. For years, he collected images, videos, and information about firearms, spending extensive time on online forums and content related to guns. This obsession went beyond simple interest and gradually became central to how he viewed the world, a means of asserting himself amid the ongoing instability of his personal life. Taken together, the portrait of Nicolas Cruz emerges as that of a young man adrift, emotionally unstable, shaped by loss, marked by long-term behavioral issues, and consumed by an interest in weapons that overshadowed opportunities for him to receive timely help. In the years leading up to the tragedy, warning signs surrounding Nicolas Cruz appeared with alarming frequency and persisted over a long period of time. In school, Cruz repeatedly displayed aggressive behavior, damaging property, threatening classmates, and reacting explosively to minor situations. Teachers and staff often noted his instability, his tense expression, volatile manner of speaking, and provocative comments. These outbursts were not simply disciplinary problems, they reflected deep psychological fractures that were increasingly difficult for him to manage. At the same time, on social media, Cruz posted content featuring weapons, inflammatory language, and disturbing statements. These posts revealed a growing obsession with firearms and violence, causing some users to feel uneasy and even report him to authorities. However, these reports were not handled thoroughly, resulting in crucial warnings being lost amid the vast stream of online data. Within the home, police were called to Cruz's residence multiple times for domestic disputes and disruptive behavior. During these incidents, Cruz showed extreme emotional fluctuation, sometimes explosive and uncontrollable, other times withdrawn and silent. School records also indicated that he had been assessed as needing special emotional support, yet he did not remain in long-term treatment. Even his expulsion from school served as a major warning about his deteriorating mental condition. All of these factors, erratic behavior, alarming online statements, inadequate intervention, and fragmented reporting combined to form a clear picture of risk, yet the pieces were never connected in a way that could have prompted timely preventive action. On the afternoon of the 14th of February 2018, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the atmosphere before dismissal felt completely ordinary. Students chatted in the courtyard, some prepared for their final class of the day, and no one imagined that within minutes, their lives would be divided into before and after, in ways they could never have anticipated. Nicolas Cruz, then 19, arrived at the school by taxi carrying a bag containing the semi-automatic rifle he had legally purchased earlier. His return to the school he once attended, a place tied to many personal difficulties, marked the beginning of a sequence of actions he had planned in advance. After stepping out of the vehicle, Cruz quietly entered the campus through a side gate, just as students were moving between periods. He headed straight to Building 12, the area designated for freshmen. There, he initiated his attack, sending chaotic sounds echoing throughout the hallway. For a brief moment, students and teachers did not understand what was happening. Some mistook the noises for fireworks or a mechanical malfunction, but the truth quickly became clear as screams and panic spread. In less than 6 minutes, the once peaceful building was thrown into turmoil. Many classrooms immediately went into lockdown, with students hiding under desks or fleeing through available exits. Emergency calls poured in, and law enforcement rapidly mobilized toward the scene. Meanwhile, Cruz used the confusion to leave the building and blend into the crowd of frightened students running outside. By changing his outer clothing and mixing in with the evacuation, he passed unnoticed by many who had no idea the perpetrator was right beside them. After leaving campus, Cruz walked to a nearby fast food restaurant, where he sat for a few minutes as if trying to steady himself. But shortly afterward, police located and arrested him without resistance. From the moment he arrived at the school to the moment he was detained, only about an hour had passed. Yet the events of that short period left a profound wound across the United States. The Parkland tragedy not only claimed the lives of students and educators, but also became one of the most shocking moments in the history of modern American education. The Parkland shooting exposed a series of serious failures across multiple levels of authority, from government agencies to the school system itself. First, the FBI had previously received a specific tip from a citizen warning that Nicolas Cruz intended to cause harm, but the information was not forwarded through the proper channels, leaving local authorities unaware and unable to intervene. Additionally, county police had been called to Cruz's home numerous times for disruptive behavior, yet each incident was handled in isolation, with no effort to compile them into a broader risk profile. In the school environment, Cruz had repeatedly shown violent behavior and clear signs of emotional instability, but psychological support was inconsistent, and his expulsion removed him from a setting where he could have been closely monitored. More concerning, the firearm Cruz used was purchased legally without any barriers. Despite multiple indications that he was emotionally unstable, taken together, these shortcomings formed a severe chain of systemic breakdowns, causing critical warnings to go unaddressed and preventing timely intervention. The Parkland tragedy quickly became one of the most influential events in the national debate over school safety and gun policy in the United States. Out of the grief and loss, a powerful movement emerged. March for Our Lives, founded by the surviving students themselves. They became leading voices, calling for gun law reform and greater public awareness of school violence prevention. In the months that followed, several states passed new measures such as red flag laws, which allow the temporary removal of firearms from individuals deemed to pose a risk. Beyond legislative changes, schools across the country also reevaluated their threat assessment procedures and expanded mental health support for students. Parkland was not only shocking because of its devastating toll, but also because it sparked a generation of students determined to speak out, transforming their pain into action aimed at preventing similar tragedies in the future. Salvador Ramos, the perpetrator in the 2022 Robb Elementary School shooting, was an 8-year-old whose life had been shaped by years of quiet, accumulating distress. Born in North Dakota but raised in Uvalde, Texas, Ramos experienced a turbulent childhood. His family faced financial hardship, frequent conflict, and a lack of stability, the kind of support essential for a child's healthy emotional development. His relationships at home were strained. Many described him as a lonely child who rarely found understanding even within his own household. At school, Ramos struggled to connect with his peers. He often sat alone, avoided conversation, and seldom participated in group activities. Although he did not have a prominent history of violence in the classroom, his withdrawn and unpredictable demeanor created a sense of distance between him and other students. A lack of confidence, combined with prolonged feelings of isolation, gradually pushed him deeper into an inner world without meaningful support. His teenage years were marked by frustration and a sense of displacement. Ramos dropped out of high school before graduating and worked at a fast food restaurant, though he was unable to maintain consistent stability there as well. Co-workers described him as quiet, quick-tempered, and often lost in his own thoughts. Family turmoil and the absence of close friendships caused him to become increasingly withdrawn. One of the defining characteristics of Ramos was his cold, detached attitude towards social connection. He spent far more time online than interacting in real life, shaping his emotional world through images and interests that often stirred concern. Upon turning 18, Ramos purchased 2 rifles, an action that signaled a shift in his mindset from mere isolation to potential danger. The portrait of Ramos that emerges is that of a young man adrift, unsupported, and left without timely intervention that might have helped him escape a deepening psychological decline. School. Ramos became increasingly quiet and withdrawn, barely interacting with classmates or teachers. This isolation was not merely a habit, but a sign of a young man severing the few remaining connections he had with the world around him. Former friends often described him as difficult to understand, quick to anger, and distant, a marked change from his earlier years. On social media, Ramos began posting troubling images and messages. He shared photos of guns, ammunition, and provocative statements that at times hinted at despair. Some viewers felt uneasy about these posts, but most simply scrolled past without taking action. Ramos also sent messages to online acquaintances, expressing dissatisfaction with life, feelings of abandonment, and a desire to attract attention through extreme means. Although these were clear warning signs, they were never addressed seriously. At home, ongoing conflict resulted in Ramos frequently running away or engaging in heated arguments with family members. He often appeared easily agitated and angry for reasons that were not always clear. Adding to this instability, Ramos dropped out of high school and received virtually no emotional support or guidance for his future, leaving him in a state of uncertainty. Upon turning 18, he immediately purchased 2 rifles and a large amount of ammunition, an action that was both abrupt and indicative of deliberate preparation. Taken together, these scattered signs formed a clear warning picture of a young man descending into dangerous territory, yet no one intervened in time to stop it. On the morning of the 24th of May 2022, the town of Uvalde was as calm as any other late school year day. While students at Robb Elementary eagerly counted down to summer break, Salvador Ramos began the day with a dark plan already taking shape. At home, an argument erupted between Ramos and his grandmother, the person who had been caring for him in recent months. As the confrontation escalated, Ramos unexpectedly shot her. Despite being critically injured, she managed to call the police, setting off a chain of events that would unfold over the next several hours. Immediately afterward, Ramos took the family's pickup truck and sped toward Robb Elementary School. Near the campus, the vehicle went out of control and crashed into a ditch. The accident drew the attention of nearby witnesses, but before anyone could react, Ramos exited the truck carrying a rifle and a large amount of ammunition. He began moving toward the elementary school, where young students were preparing for their next class. Ramos approached a side door reported at the time to have been unsecured and entered the building quickly. From the moment he stepped inside, events escalated within minutes, producing consequences that would prove immeasurable. He made his way to a pair of adjoining classrooms where 4th-grade students were present. In what had been a peaceful learning environment, chaos erupted suddenly, leaving teachers and children struggling to understand what was happening. Once authorities were notified, police and rapid response units rushed to the scene. Outside, frantic parents gathered, desperately calling their children, without success. Inside, Ramos barricaded himself in one of the 2 classrooms. For more than an hour, moments of panic, silence, and desperate attempts to find safety created one of the most painful and tense episodes the Uvalde community had ever faced. Finally, after a tactical team decided to breach the room, a brief confrontation ensued, and Ramos was fatally shot. From the moment he left his home to the moment he was stopped, only a few hours had passed. Yet the impact on the nation was profound. Robb Elementary, once just a small school in a quiet town, suddenly became the focus of worldwide attention. As 21 lives, 19 students and 2 teachers were tragically lost in an unimaginable tragedy. The Robb Elementary incident exposed a series of serious failures in both emergency response and risk prevention systems. To begin with, several reports indicated that the side door through which Ramos entered had not been properly locked, providing him with direct access to the classroom area. When the crisis began, law enforcement officers arrived at the scene relatively quickly. Yet it took more than an hour for them to breach the classroom where Ramos had barricaded himself. During that time, communication among responding units became disorganized, leading to a misinterpretation of the situation. Many commanders believed the incident had shifted into a barricaded subject scenario rather than recognizing it as an ongoing active shooter situation requiring immediate intervention. This delay resulted in critical minutes being lost. Additionally, monitoring of Ramos's online behavior and social environment prior to the attack had been insufficient, preventing authorities or community members from connecting the many warning signs that had emerged over an extended period. These failures highlighted significant inconsistencies in school security procedures and emergency response protocols. The tragedy at Robb Elementary sent shockwaves across the United States, prompting widespread discussions about school security and gun control policy. The loss of 21 victims, most of them children, sparked public demands for immediate changes in how students are protected. In response, the federal government passed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, one of the most significant reforms in decades, which strengthened background checks for young gun buyers and expanded investments in mental health services within schools. In Uvalde, the victims' families became steadfast advocates for accountability and improvements to emergency response procedures. Schools nationwide also reevaluated their safety standards, reinforcing entry points, upgrading alarm systems, and training educators to recognize potential risks. Robb Elementary, once an unremarkable small-town school, has become a symbol of both profound grief and the determination to pursue meaningful change to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two perpetrators of the 1999 Columbine High School shooting, were a pair defined by sharp contrasts yet dangerously complementary traits. Eric Harris, born in 1981, grew up in a military family and lived in multiple states before settling in Colorado. He was intelligent, technologically adept, and far more skilled with computers than most of his peers. Yet, behind his seemingly ordinary exterior was a volatile personality. Harris harbored deep anger, resentment, and a belief that he was superior to others. Many who interacted with him described him as sharp but cold, unpredictable, and at times, openly hostile. Dylan Klebold, on the other hand, was almost the complete opposite. Born in 1981 inches, Colorado, he came from an educated, loving family. But beneath that supportive upbringing lay an inner world marked by despair and emotional conflict. Klebold often felt he didn't belong anywhere, caught between the desire to fit in and the quiet pain of feeling unable to do so. While Harris projected confidence and intensity, Klebold appeared introspective, withdrawn, and vulnerable. When the two met, Harris and Klebold quickly formed a unique bond, a kind of alliance rooted in their shared sense of being disconnected from the world. Harris acted as the driving force behind their growing extremism, while Klebold absorbed and internalized those influences. Over several years, they developed a private world in which anger, insecurity, and delusion were amplified. They exchanged dark thoughts about society, feeling mistreated, and their growing fascination with destruction, gradually forging a dangerous partnership. The portrait that emerges is not simply that of two troubled teenagers, but of two distorted personalities, one whose rage was directed outward and one whose despair turned inward, combining into a destructive force no one anticipated. Before the Columbine tragedy unfolded, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold exhibited numerous warning signs. Though these appeared in isolated fragments and were never recognized as part of a larger, escalating threat, Harris posted strongly hateful content online, including writings attacking society, threatening others, and expressing a desire to inflict harm. These materials were not merely impulsive outbursts. They reflected a dangerous mindset in which he viewed himself as superior and saw violence as a means of asserting power. Klebold, meanwhile, showed clear signs of depression through his journals and school assignments. He wrote about loneliness, despair, and persistent thoughts of death. His classwork often contained violent or tragic imagery, which raised concern among some teachers. But no one connected these expressions to a serious risk. His words were indirect cries for help from a teenager who was gradually losing his connection to life. Both Harris and Klebold had also been arrested in 1998 for breaking into a parked truck. Although they were placed in a diversion program, they completed it superficially while continuing to cultivate extremist ideas in secret. During this period, they began researching how to build homemade explosives, purchasing materials, and documenting their plans in journals and private videos. They even tested weapons on camera, demonstrating deliberate preparation rather than impulsive behavior. At school, teachers had noticed the violent themes in their writing, but due to a lack of communication between departments, these concerns were never passed on to authorities. Friends had heard the pair make dark, sinister jokes, but most dismissed them as exaggerations or attempts at humor. Taken together, the signs from hateful ideology and severe depression to violent imagery and criminal behavior formed a clear map of escalating risk. Unfortunately, no one connected these warnings into a full picture that might have prevented the tragedy taking shape. The morning of the 20th of April 1999 began at Columbine High School like any ordinary school day. Students chatted before class, and the hallways were filled with the sound of footsteps. No one knew that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, two seniors, had been planning for more than a year and had chosen that very morning to carry out their attack. They drove to campus carrying guns, ammunition, and homemade explosive devices hidden under long coats. The first step in their plan was not gunfire, but planting 2 large bombs in the cafeteria during the busiest time of day to cause mass casualties. However, the devices failed to detonate as intended. When the primary plan collapsed, Harris and Klebold moved on to Plan B. At around 11:19 a.m., they walked toward the area outside the cafeteria and began their assault. Chaos erupted within seconds. Many students fled in panic, while others were still trying to understand what was happening. The pair then moved into the school building itself, where the hallways and mid-morning classes suddenly became danger zones for which no one had been prepared. The most devastating moments took place in the library, where many students had taken shelter, believing it to be a safe place. Harris and Klebold entered and sent fear to its peak. The noise, the screams, and the suffocating tension made time feel as though it had stopped. In less than 20 minutes, they inflicted catastrophic harm before leaving the library and wandering through the school for a short while longer. As police surrounded the building, Harris and Klebold seemed to realize their plan could not continue. Instead of attempting to escape or negotiate, they returned to the library, the site of most of the casualties, and ended the attack by taking their own lives. From the moment the first sounds rang out until silence fell again, the entire event unfolded in under an hour. Yet its impact has endured far beyond that brief span of time. Columbine became not only a painful memory, but a turning point that forever changed the way the United States views school violence. The Columbine shooting exposed numerous critical failures in both school oversight and law enforcement response systems. Although Harris had posted explicit threats on his personal website and possessed materials related to bomb making, this information was never forwarded to the police through proper channels. A detailed report submitted by a parent warning about Harris's potential danger was also never fully processed. Within the school, the violent themes in Harris's and Klebold's writings raised concern among teachers, but there was no cross-departmental coordination to assess the risk they posed. Prior to the attack, there were no measures in place to restrict weapons on school grounds, and the fact that the 2 students wore long coats capable of concealing firearms went unnoticed. When the attack began, the police response was slow and relied heavily on containment tactics, focusing on surrounding the building rather than rapidly engaging the threat. These factors collectively revealed a lack of consistency and standardization in identifying and addressing warning signs. Columbine became a turning point that profoundly reshaped how the United States views school violence and educational security. The incident was shocking not only because of its severity, but also because it exposed how vulnerable schools were to threats originating from their own students. In the aftermath, nationwide discussions intensified around bullying, adolescent mental health, and the influence of violent cultural trends on young people. It was also the moment when many schools began implementing lockdown drills for the first time, increasing security personnel, and establishing early warning systems. Law enforcement agencies across the country revised their response strategies, shifting from a contain and wait model to immediate engagement to neutralize active threats. Columbine became a central topic in sociology, psychology, and media studies, raising questions about the community's responsibility to recognize and support students showing signs of distress. To this day, the name Columbine remains a powerful reminder of the importance of prevention and early intervention. Dimitrios Pagortzis, the perpetrator in the 2018 shooting at Santa Fe High School, was a 17-year-old student whom many people had long regarded as quiet and unremarkable. Born and raised in Santa Fe, Texas, he came from a Greek-American family known for its discipline and strong work ethic. Friends described Pagortzis as reserved and soft-spoken, but not disruptive. He played on the school's football team and participated in the dance group at his local Greek Orthodox church. Outwardly, he appeared to be a typical student, relatively well-adjusted and without any history of serious behavioral issues or violence. Yet behind that mild exterior was an inner world marked by growing conflict. Those who knew him more closely noticed an increasing sense of withdrawal. Pagortzis shared little about his thoughts, kept his distance from peers, and seemed to carry unspoken sadness he never articulated. Although he was not someone who was bullied, he nonetheless felt disconnected, as if he could not find a clear place for himself within the school community. The Pagortzis family legally owned firearms, and he grew up familiar with Texas gun culture. At the time, this did not raise concern because he had never shown threatening behavior or acted impulsively. On the contrary, many teachers described him as polite, respectful, and consistently well-behaved in interactions with adults. Even so, his quietness and increasing detachment gradually formed a difficult-to-reach emotional gap. No one truly knew what he was thinking or what he was struggling with behind his calm appearance. Small frustrations, feelings of separation, and internal instability accumulated over time, shaping a portrait of a teenager silently carrying wounds that eventually distorted into something no one could have anticipated. Before the tragedy at Santa Fe High School, Dimitrios Pagortzis exhibited several notable warning signs, though they were not as abrupt or dramatic as in some other cases. The first changes appeared in how he interacted with peers. Pagortzis became quieter, more withdrawn, and at times distanced himself from the group he had previously been part of. Teachers noticed that he smiled less, spoke less, and seemed to carry a persistent sadness he could not express. Because these changes happened gradually, no one believed they could lead to anything serious. Some classmates recalled that Pagortzis began showing interest in darker, more ominous symbols, long coats, inverted crosses, and imagery tied to rebellion and death. He did not hide these interests, but he also never explained them. For many teenagers, such expressions are often dismissed as stylistic choices or part of exploring identity. So few saw them as a true warning sign. In Pagortzis' case, however, they reflected a subtle shift in his emotional state. In his personal journal and handwritten notes later recovered, Pagortzis described dark thoughts, including a desire to create drastic change or expressions of anger towards certain individuals. Although he never shared these thoughts publicly, the act of writing them down indicated emotions that had been present for a long time without being addressed in a healthy way. Additionally, the Pagortzis family legally owned firearms, and he had easy access to them. While he had never used guns in a way that raised concern, access to weapons combined with increasing emotional withdrawal was a dangerous factor that went unrecognized. When viewed together, the signs, behavioral changes, fascination with dark imagery, prolonged sadness, and growing social distance form pieces of a warning picture that, unfortunately, no one noticed in time. On the morning of the 18th of May 2018, Santa Fe High School began like any other day. Students had just settled into their first period classes, and the hallways grew quiet as everyone took their seats. Within that ordinary setting, 17-year-old Dimitrios Pagortzis entered the school with a plan he had prepared in advance. He wore the long coat his classmates were familiar with, though none of them knew that underneath it he carried two firearms, a shotgun and a revolver taken from his father's home. Moving quietly and without drawing attention, Pagortzis walked straight to the art classrooms, where the first class of the day was underway. At around 7:30 a.m., the calm of the small school was shattered. The classroom where Pagortzis stopped became the center of sudden chaos. Students and teachers found themselves in a state of panic, scrambling to hide or escape. Alarms rang throughout the building, alerting nearby classes and plunging the entire school into fear and confusion. Pagortzis did not stop there. He moved through several classrooms, carrying out his attack step by step. Some students managed to flee through back exits, while others hid in closets, behind desks, or under equipment. The situation quickly grew chaotic and difficult to control as information spread rapidly but unevenly. Many teachers immediately locked their classroom doors and activated emergency procedures to protect their students, while the noise coming from the affected area heightened the sense of danger. Within approximately 30 minutes, police officers arrived at the scene and approached the building with extreme caution. They identified Pagortzis near the area where he had started, where he had also placed several unexploded improvised devices to create a temporary barrier. The confrontation between officers and the perpetrator was tense but brief. Unlike many other school shooters, Pagortzis surrendered after being cornered, setting down his weapons. When arrested, he stated that he didn't have the courage to take his own life, an indication of the internal conflict he had never shared with anyone. From the moment Pagortzis entered the school to the time he was taken into custody passed only a short span of time, yet the impact was immense. 10 people, 8 students and 2 teachers lost their lives, and many others were injured. Santa Fe High School, a place meant for learning and growth, suddenly became the site of one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in Texas history. The Santa Fe High School incident exposed several weaknesses in the school system's ability to prevent and identify potential threats. Although Pagortz's had shown a growing interest in dark symbols and exhibited unusual behavioral changes, the school had no sufficiently robust mechanism to assess his psychological risk in a comprehensive way. Student behavior monitoring relied largely on individual observation and lacked coordinated communication between teachers, school counselors, and mental health professionals. Additionally, the firearms Pagortz's used were taken from his home without secure storage, highlighting a critical gap in family oversight, an important factor that is often overlooked in risk assessments. While law enforcement responded relatively quickly once the incident began, the shortcomings in the earlier stages revealed that school security systems were still not sensitive enough to detect warning signs before they escalated into serious harm. The tragedy at Santa Fe High School sent shockwaves through the Texas community and across the United States, forcing lawmakers, schools, and parents to take school safety far more seriously. In the aftermath, many schools in the state implemented additional security measures, such as strengthening access control, increasing the presence of security personnel, and expanding threat assessment programs for students showing signs of distress. The Santa Fe shooting also intensified discussions about firearm storage in the home, emphasizing the responsibility of parents to lock and secure guns safely. At the same time, the Santa Fe community organized memorial events, psychological support programs, and fundraising efforts to assist the families of victims, demonstrating a powerful sense of solidarity. While the tragedy left deep pain behind, it also served as a catalyst for statewide reevaluation of school security policies, with the goal of preventing similar incidents in the future. Ethan Crumbley, the perpetrator in the 2021 Oxford High School shooting, was a 5-year-old student who appeared quiet, polite, and largely unnoticed. To teachers, he seemed like a capable student who sat silently in class and rarely caused disruptions. Yet behind this calm exterior existed a complex inner world shaped by anxiety, loneliness, and accumulating psychological stress. Ethan was the kind of student who was easily labeled reserved, but his quietness did not stem from ordinary introversion. It was the result of suppressed emotions and a lack of meaningful connection. Ethan's family life was also marked by instability. His parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, were not entirely inattentive, but their permissive and loosely structured parenting style left Ethan struggling to find emotional stability. The pressures of adolescence, combined with inconsistent guidance, led him to withdraw even further. He spent much of his time alone in his room, immersed in online spaces where he felt more in control than he did in real life. In everyday interactions, Ethan often seemed distant, speaking softly and keeping his gaze unfocused. Many classmates described him as someone who always looked like he had something on his mind. To some, his silence appeared to be just a personality trait. For Ethan, however, it concealed increasingly chaotic thoughts that were slipping beyond his ability to manage. One concerning aspect of Ethan's profile was his particular fascination with topics related to weapons and violence, something he rarely spoke about openly but expressed through his personal notes and online searches. When his father purchased a Sig Sauer 9mm handgun on Black Friday and referred to it as a gift for Ethan, the event became a significant turning point in a thought pattern that had already shown signs of instability. The portrait of Ethan Crumbley that emerges is that of a teenager caught between silence, psychological pressure, and insufficient parental oversight. A dangerous combination that ultimately led to a tragedy no one had anticipated. Before the tragedy at Oxford High School, Ethan Crumbley exhibited numerous clear, even explicit warning signs, yet all of them were minimized or inadequately addressed. In the weeks leading up to the incident, teachers noticed increasingly troubling behavior. Ethan drew images of guns, bullets, and violence in his class assignments. These weren't random doodles typical of teenagers. They were accompanied by disturbing phrases such as, "The thoughts won't stop," "My life is useless," and "Help me." The drawings alarmed his teachers, who immediately reported them to school administrators. Online, Ethan searched for ammunition during class. When confronted by a teacher, he tried to deflect the situation, but the act itself was a serious red flag. The school contacted his parents, yet their response was dismissive and irresponsible. Ethan's mother even texted him, "You have to learn not to get caught." Privately, Ethan's journals and handwritten notes revealed a deteriorating mental state marked by isolation, stress, and fixation on death. These thoughts had progressed beyond abstract imaginings and had taken shape as concrete plans. However, neither his family nor the school engaged deeply enough to recognize the urgency of his condition. On the morning of the shooting, Ethan was called to the office with his parents after teachers discovered another alarming drawing, again depicting a gun, along with desperate pleas for help. The school recommended that his parents take him home and seek immediate mental health support, but they refused, leaving him at school without checking his backpack, which contained the handgun they had purchased for him just days earlier. The chain of warnings formed a series of unmistakable clues, each one placed plainly in view, yet no one assembled them into the full picture of the danger that was rapidly approaching. Around midday on the 30th of November 2021, Oxford High School moved along with the familiar rhythm of a typical weekday. After his meeting with school administrators that morning, where teachers and staff expressed deep concern about his disturbing drawings, Ethan Crumbley returned to class as if nothing were unusual. No one knew that inside his backpack was the 9mm handgun his parents had purchased just days earlier. The meeting ended with no intervention, and Ethan slipped back into his seat, hiding the turmoil raging in his mind. At approximately 12:50 p.m., everything changed. Ethan stood up, left the classroom, and walked into the hallway. He moved with such calmness that few realized anything was wrong. When he began his attack, the familiar school environment instantly dissolved into chaos. Sounds echoed through the corridor, and students and teachers scrambled for safety. Classroom doors were locked in accordance with emergency procedures, while other classes quickly evacuated as alert notifications spread across the building. Within minutes, 911 dispatchers were flooded with calls from students hiding in classrooms, teachers securing their doors, and nearby residents who heard unusual noises. Police officers arrived within minutes of the first report and entered the building immediately. Following active threat protocols, chaos swept across the campus. Students ran across the athletic fields. Parents rushed to the scene in panic, and ambulances and police vehicles converged on a place that had been peaceful only moments earlier. When officers encountered Ethan, he surrendered without resistance, placing the weapon on the ground. To many of the responding officers, he appeared unnervingly calm, as if everything had unfolded exactly as he expected. The time between Ethan leaving his classroom and his arrest lasted only about 5 minutes, yet the consequences became one of the most devastating school tragedies in Michigan's history. 4 students were killed and several others injured, casting a heavy shadow not only over Oxford but across the entire nation. The paths where students fled, the silent hallways afterward, and the backpacks dropped in haste became haunting images etched into the community's memory. The event unfolded so quickly that many people at the school only understood the full reality when the final announcement came. The immediate danger had ended, but the tragedy had only just begun. The Oxford shooting revealed a chain of serious systemic failures in which multiple clear warning signs were not properly addressed. First, the school had already identified concerning behaviors from Ethan's searches for ammunition to his violent drawings, accompanied by pleas for help, yet did not activate a high-level threat assessment protocol. The meeting with his parents on the morning of the incident should have resulted in a backpack search or a requirement that Ethan be taken home, but neither action was taken. On the parents' side, purchasing a handgun as a gift for a teenager experiencing psychological distress, and then storing the firearm and ammunition insecurely at home, represented a major lapse in judgment. Compounding this, the lack of meaningful communication between the family and the school meant that critical warning signs were never combined into a full picture of imminent danger. The result was a series of missed opportunities, each one visible in hindsight, that could have prevented the tragedy before it unfolded. The Oxford tragedy had an impact far beyond the walls of a single school. It became a national focal point in the debate over parental responsibility and firearm oversight. For the first time in U.S. history, the parents of a school shooter were criminally charged for their indirect role in enabling the tragedy, setting a new legal precedent regarding family accountability for storing and granting access to weapons for minors. The case also prompted many states to reconsider their household gun safety laws, especially those related to firearm storage and early threat detection. In Oxford, the local community organized extensive psychological support programs and memorial events to help students and parents cope with the trauma. The story of Oxford quickly became a central example in research on risk prevention and school safety governance, underscoring the reality that overlooking even the smallest warning signs can lead to irreversible consequences. Gabriel Parker, the perpetrator in the 2018 Marshall County High School shooting, was a 5-year-old student widely regarded as exemplary and unremarkable in the best sense. He earned good grades, came from a stable family, and was described as polite, well-behaved, and consistently respectful. Unlike many perpetrators in other school shootings, Parker was not bullied, did not exhibit serious behavioral problems, and had no history of violence. To classmates and teachers, he seemed like the model of a quiet, likable kid. However, behind his reserved exterior was an inner world that few understood. Parker rarely shared his true feelings, even with people close to him. He was deeply private, avoided expressing personal thoughts, and tended to keep his worries to himself. Teachers often described him as someone who showed little emotion, a temperament that sometimes made it difficult for others to know what he was truly feeling. This silent detachment made Parker increasingly difficult to read over time. Despite his strong academic performance, he did not participate in many extracurricular activities and spent much of his time alone reading, thinking, or withdrawing into his own thoughts. Friends recalled him as smart but quiet, as if he were always preoccupied with something no one else could see. Few imagined that behind this calm demeanor, negative emotions were steadily building. Parker's family had no record of significant psychological concerns. He was not bullied, had no legal troubles, and rarely caused issues at school. Yet this very complete normalcy concealed a dangerous reality. Parker lacked healthy ways to express emotion, did not have the skills to cope with pressure, and had no adults around him who recognized the concerning thoughts developing in silence. His profile became a striking example of one of the most unpredictable types of school shooters, those who show almost no obvious warning signs to the outside world. Before the tragedy at Marshall County High School, Gabriel Parker displayed several warning signs, though they were subtle and easy to overlook. Unlike many other cases, Parker did not post threatening content, act out, or display overtly violent behavior. Instead, the changes within him unfolded quietly over time. He became more withdrawn than usual, smiling less, speaking less, and participating less in conversations with friends. Some classmates sensed that Parker felt more distant, but they assumed it was simply his personality or a typical teenage phase. Notes later discovered revealed that Parker had been developing distorted thoughts in a systematic way. In his journal, he expressed curiosity and even fixation on causing chaos and experiencing the feeling of control in an extreme situation. His writing was strikingly cold for a teenager known to be polite and well-behaved, suggesting that these thoughts had existed for some time but went unnoticed because Parker never shared them with anyone. Another sign was his increasing isolation. Although he was not bullied, Parker still felt emotionally detached from peers, a kind of internal loneliness that made it difficult for him to form meaningful connections. He spent much of his time alone, sought help from no one, and never displayed an obvious need for emotional support. This silence meant that any signs of distress remained too faint for others to recognize. Additionally, Parker had access to firearms in his household, a factor that drew little concern because he had never shown aggression. Yet this access, combined with his private nature and ability to conceal emotions, created a dangerous risk that no one identified. In hindsight, each small sign pointed to a teenager experiencing a quiet crisis, a crisis invisible to those around him until it was too late. On the morning of the 23rd of January 2018, Marshall County High School began like any other winter school day in Benton, Kentucky. Students gathered in the commons area before classes, an everyday space where friends talked, exchanged homework, and slowly eased into the day. Amid the familiar bustle, one 5-year-old Gabriel Parker appeared as calm and ordinary as ever. No one knew that inside his backpack was the handgun he had secretly taken from home. At around 7:57 a.m., in the brief moment between normalcy and chaos, Parker pulled out the gun and began firing. Everything happened so quickly that the crowd of students barely had time to register what was unfolding. Teachers nearby rushed to assist students, while others immediately locked classroom doors as part of emergency procedures. Within seconds, the commons, the usual morning gathering spot, became the center of panic. Screams and footsteps echoed through the hallways. Students ran in every direction, some sprinting outside, others seeking cover in classrooms or behind whatever objects they could find. Though the incident lasted only moments, it was enough to shatter the deep sense of safety that had long defined the small community. As soon as the 911 calls came in, police and emergency responders raced to the scene. Their response time was noted as extremely fast, taking only minutes to reach the danger zone. During that time, Parker attempted to blend in with the students fleeing the area, as if he were another witness trying to escape. But his hesitant movements and unusual expression drew officers' attention, and he was apprehended on campus without resistance. During initial custody, Parker remained unnervingly calm. At the police station, he admitted to the shooting in an even, emotionless tone, displaying neither anger nor panic. He told investigators he had planned the act and wanted to see what it would feel like to create chaos, an explanation that left officers stunned. There was no personal grudge, no specific target, only a distorted curiosity from a teenager lost in his own thoughts. The event lasted less than 2 minutes, yet the consequences were devastating. 2 students, Bailey Holt and Preston Cope, were killed, and more than a dozen others were injured. As medical teams evacuated the victims, many teachers and parents stood in shock, struggling to comprehend how such a tragedy could strike their close-knit community. What made the pain even heavier was the realization that the perpetrator was not a stranger, but a quiet, high-achieving boy who had once sat in the classroom right next to theirs. The Marshall County case revealed major gaps in the early identification of risk among students. Because Parker had no history of violence, caused no disruptions, and was consistently viewed as well-behaved, the system had no reason or mechanism to assess him as a potential threat. The school lacked a structured process for monitoring students who were excessively withdrawn or showing signs of quiet internal distress. Teachers, though they noticed subtle changes in Parker's behavior, had no clear protocol for reporting concerns based on intuition or mild observations. In addition, Parker's ability to access a firearm at home without any barriers reflected weak household gun safety practices, an especially dangerous factor that is often underestimated in small communities. As a result, the prevention system completely overlooked a teenager slipping into distorted thinking, and opportunities for early intervention were missed from the very beginning. The Marshall County shooting had a profound impact on the Kentucky community, a place long known for its calm and relative distance from school-related tragedies. In the aftermath, schools across the region began reassessing their security procedures, from student monitoring to campus access control. The event also highlighted an often overlooked issue. Students who do not cause disruptions or draw attention yet may be experiencing silent internal crises. This led many schools to develop more proactive mental health support programs and to encourage teachers and students to pay closer attention to subtle behavioral changes among peers. The Marshall County community organized memorials, fundraising efforts, and emotional support initiatives for the victims' families, turning collective solidarity into a foundation for healing. The tragedy also contributed to nationwide discussions about household gun safety and the need for stronger social-emotional education within schools. Jalen Freiberg, the perpetrator in the 2014 Marysville-Pilchuck High School shooting, remains one of the most perplexing cases in the history of school violence because he did not fit the typical profile of a shooter. At 15, Freiberg, a member of the Tulalip tribes, was a popular, outgoing, and well-liked teenager. He played on the football team, was elected to the school's homecoming court, and was frequently seen smiling, embodying the image of a model student with no obvious behavioral issues. He also had a strong relationship with his family and was raised in a culturally rooted tribal environment that emphasized connection, respect, and communal responsibility. This is precisely what makes Jalen's story so difficult to understand in retrospect. Beneath his positive public exterior, he was beginning to struggle with emotional turmoil tied to friendships, romantic relationships, and social pressures, issues no one on the outside recognized. Freiberg was not isolated or troubled in the conventional sense. He held a solid social position at school, had supportive relationships, and appeared to have a promising future. These factors made any internal instability exceedingly difficult to detect. Family members later shared that Freiberg was deeply sensitive, emotional, and easily hurt when faced with disappointment. Yet he rarely talked about his personal problems, and because he always projected confidence, no one imagined he might be carrying profound emotional pain. The contrast between his public persona and his private struggles makes Freiberg's profile uniquely complex. A beloved teenager with family support and social standing, who nonetheless fell into an emotional spiral that ultimately led to a sudden and devastating act. The warning signs in Jalen Freiberg's case did not appear in loud or easily recognizable ways, as they often do in other incidents. Instead, they surfaced quietly through emotional cues, social media activity, and shifts in his personal relationships. In the period leading up to the shooting, Freiberg posted numerous social media messages expressing sadness, disappointment, and deep emotional hurt following romantic conflict and tension within his close friend group. Some posts even carried a tone of desperation. But because Freiberg was widely known as friendly and upbeat, his peers interpreted these signals as temporary teenage sadness rather than indications of serious distress. Freiberg also began showing behaviors that differed from his usual personality. He became quieter, sometimes avoiding interaction with people he had once been close to. A few individuals noticed that his expression wasn't the same, as if he were holding on to emotions he could not articulate. Yet, because he continued participating in sports, kept smiling, and appeared normal in group settings, no one suspected that these changes pointed to a deeper emotional crisis. The most concerning sign when viewed in hindsight was Freiberg's decision to text his close friends and invite them to have lunch with him on the day of the shooting. To those invited, it seemed like a routine social gesture. In reality, it revealed that Freiberg had planned his actions deliberately. His ability to access his father's legally owned firearm without detection further underscored the risks associated with insufficient household gun oversight. Overall, the warning signs in Freiberg's case ranged from emotional distress and negative social media posts to behavioral changes and unusual actions immediately before the incident. But because he was widely perceived as a cheerful, well-connected teenager, these signals were minimized or entirely overlooked. The morning of the 24th of October 2014 began like any other at Marysville Pilchuck High School, with students eagerly looking forward to the upcoming lunch period. In the school's large cafeteria, the sounds of chatter mixed with the clinking of trays, creating the familiar atmosphere of a typical Friday school day. Few realized that within this seemingly ordinary setting, Jalen Freiberg, one of the school's most prominent and well-liked students, was preparing to carry out an act that would shake the entire community. Shortly before lunch, Freiberg sent messages inviting a close group of friends, those he had long been closest to sit with him. No one suspected that the invitation carried any special meaning. When they arrived, they found Freiberg already seated, looking calm, though noticeably quieter than usual. Some smiled and walked toward him, completely unaware of the growing tension in the air. Around lunchtime, Freiberg suddenly acted. The shift was so abrupt that many nearby students did not immediately understand what was happening. The once bustling cafeteria was thrown into chaos. Students fled in panic. Some hid under tables, while others ran toward emergency exits. The sound of chairs falling, footsteps, and shouts blended together as the familiar space transformed into a scene of fear and confusion. Teachers and staff rushed to help, pulling students away from danger while nearby classrooms locked their doors according to emergency protocol. Police received the first 911 calls within seconds and arrived quickly on campus. As they approached the cafeteria, they were struck by the eerie silence that followed the initial chaos. By that time, Freiberg had ended the event himself. For responding officers, the entire incident had unfolded within just a few minutes, a brief span of time that nonetheless left devastating consequences, especially because all the victims were Freiberg's close friends. This added a uniquely heartbreaking dimension to the tragedy. It did not stem from hatred or target strangers, but from a teenager caught in profound emotional turmoil. As medical teams entered to treat and evacuate the injured, the school fell into a state of shock. Students sat huddled outside, many wrapped in blankets, stunned and speechless as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. Marysville, a small, close-knit community, faced a loss far beyond what anyone could have imagined, a tragedy unfolding at the very moment they believed themselves to be safe. The Marysville Pilchuck case exposed subtle yet critical systemic shortcomings, largely rooted in the tendency to underestimate emotional warning signs in students perceived as stable. Because Freiberg was a popular, outgoing student with no history of violence, neither the school nor the broader community took his sadness or negative social media posts seriously. There was no mechanism for closely monitoring emotional changes in students who maintained a positive social image, resulting in early warning signals being entirely overlooked. Additionally, Freiberg's easy access to his father's firearm, a legally owned weapon that was not securely stored, highlighted gaps in household gun safety practices and awareness. These failures did not stem from a slow on-scene response, but from the system's inability to see the crisis unfolding behind the polished exterior Freiberg consistently presented. The tragedy at Marysville Pilchuck sent shockwaves not only through the Tulalip community but across the United States, in large part because the perpetrator was a well-liked student, an image that sharply contrasted with typical school shooting profiles. The incident prompted educators and mental health professionals to reconsider how risk is identified, not only by focusing on students who display overtly troubling behavior, but also by recognizing that those who appear positive and well-adjusted may still be experiencing hidden emotional crises. Marysville became a key example in research on the social mask of adolescents, their ability to conceal deep emotional distress behind a polished exterior. In the aftermath, schools in the region expanded mental health support programs, encouraged students to share their feelings, and trained teachers to better recognize subtle psychological cues. At the same time, the Tulalip community organized healing initiatives emphasizing unity and the preservation of cultural values as long-term sources of emotional support. The case also contributed to nationwide conversations about safe firearm storage within households. Jeff Wise, the perpetrator in the 2005 Red Lake Senior High School shooting, was a 16-year-old carrying the weight of profound personal tragedies from an early age. Wise grew up in the Ojibwe community on the Red Lake Indian Reservation, a place rich in cultural identity but marked by economic hardship and limited living conditions. His childhood was shaped by deep losses. His father, a tribal police officer, died by suicide when Wise was only a few years old. His mother was severely injured in a car accident and required long-term care in a specialized facility. These successive upheavals meant Wise never experienced the stable home life many of his peers had. After his family's turmoil, Wise moved in with his grandfather and his grandfather's partner, both of whom made genuine efforts to give him a sense of normalcy. Yet emotional emptiness continued to follow him. Quiet, introverted, and often withdrawn from community activities, Wise struggled to connect with others. Many classmates described him as distant and expressionless. He was occasionally bullied for his appearance and demeanor, though he rarely reacted and endured the mistreatment in silence. Wise had a talent for drawing and a strong interest in animation, but over time, his artwork shifted toward darker themes. The internet became his primary escape, a space where he expressed more of himself than he ever did offline. But it was also where he encountered extremist content, depressive communities, and violent ideologies, all of which deepened his psychological distress. Friends later said that Wise seemed to live between two worlds: a quiet, reserved boy in real life and a lonely figure burdened by heavy thoughts online. He lacked a strong emotional support network and had no consistent adult guidance to help him process the long-standing trauma of his childhood. The portrait of Jeff Wise is that of a deeply isolated teenager, carrying invisible pain and gradually losing direction in life. Before the tragedy occurred, Jeff Wise had displayed numerous warning signs across his behavior, emotions, and online activity. At school, he became increasingly withdrawn and isolated from his peers. He often sat alone, spoke very little, and rarely participated in group activities. Some classmates recalled that Wise was teased for his appearance and quiet demeanor, which pushed him even further into his private world. Because he never lashed out or reacted aggressively, few recognized how serious his situation had become. Wise's drawings also revealed a deeply troubled inner life. Dark imagery, violent themes, and a consistent sense of loneliness. These weren't merely stylistic choices, they were distress signals from a teenager struggling to communicate a pain he couldn't express verbally. Yet no teacher or counselor intervened in a meaningful way, partly due to limited resources within the community, and partly because the artwork was dismissed as a creative outlet typical of adolescence. Online, where Wise was far more active than in real life, the warning signs were even clearer. He posted content with extremist undertones, bleak worldviews, and an increasing fascination with violence. Some users noticed his responses to dark topics, including discussions about despair and feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. These were major red flags. But because they occurred in digital spaces and no one in his family monitored them, they went entirely unnoticed. Wise also showed signs of severe depression, insomnia, exhaustion, journal entries filled with hopelessness, and descriptions of feeling completely cut off from others. Although he had been prescribed antidepressants at one point, there was no long-term follow-up or adequate psychological support. Taken together, social isolation, a bleak inner world, exposure to extremist content, bullying, and a lack of family support, a clear picture emerges. Wise was a teenager in a silent downward spiral, surrounded by warning signs that no one was close enough to recognize or intervene before it was too late. On the afternoon of the 21st of March, 2005, the Red Lake Indian Reservation appeared as calm as any other day. But inside the home where Jeff Wise lived with his grandfather, a tragic chain of events had already begun. Wise, then 16, was in a state of deep emotional turmoil after years of depression and isolation. Early that afternoon, he attacked his grandfather and his grandfather's partner, then took a handgun, a shotgun, and his grandfather's tribal police patrol vehicle, an escalation that instantly placed the situation at an extraordinary level of danger, though no one yet knew what was happening. Wise then drove to Red Lake Senior High School, a place he once attended and where he had long felt most disconnected. The patrol car's flashing lights made it appear as if a tribal officer was arriving on duty. Around 2:45 p.m., he stepped out dressed in black and armed with the weapons taken from home. Before entering the building, he opened fire on the security officer stationed at the entrance, plunging the school's front area into chaos. Some students initially mistook the noise for nearby construction until they saw people running in panic. Inside the school, Wise moved through the hallways as students and teachers were preparing to wrap up the afternoon period. Classrooms went into lockdown, but the moment unfolded too quickly for some students to react in time. The incident lasted only minutes, yet the impact was devastating. Teachers rushed to pull students into safe spaces, while others attempted to alert tribal police and assist those who were injured. As tribal law enforcement and the FBI arrived, Wise retreated into a classroom. Surrounded and with nowhere left to go, he ended the attack by taking his own life before officers could apprehend him. The entire sequence from the moment he left his home to the final moments inside the school occurred in less than an hour. For the Red Lake community, however, it became one of the most painful hours in their history, taking the lives of several students and a teacher and leaving deep psychological wounds for the hundreds who witnessed or were affected by the tragedy. After the school was secured, the scene outside was filled with parents running toward the campus, desperate to hear their children's names on the list of survivors. A heavy silence settled over the small, close-knit community as the realization sank in. The perpetrator was not an outsider, but a teenager who had grown up among them, a child carrying a burden of pain that no one had been able to see or help him escape. The Red Lake case exposed long-standing systemic failures in supporting adolescent mental health within indigenous communities. Jeff Wise had a documented history of depression and had once been prescribed medication, yet he never received consistent follow-up care, an outcome tied to the limited healthcare resources and the lack of stable counseling services available in the area. Neither the school nor the community had an effective mechanism to share information or recognize the seriousness of Wise's isolation, nor the troubling signals he posted online. Additionally, his ability to access the firearms belonging to his grandfather, who served in the tribal security force, revealed gaps in safe storage practices within the household. Local authorities also lacked early warning systems and structured risk assessment tools, allowing Wise's escalating psychological distress to persist unnoticed. Together, these shortcomings created a dangerous void, one in which a teenager descending into crisis remained unseen and never received the intervention he urgently needed. The Red Lake tragedy left a profound and lasting wound on a community already burdened by generations of loss. It was not merely a school shooting. It was a blow to the spiritual heart of the Ojibwe people, where nearly every family is connected in some way. In the aftermath, indigenous communities across the United States renewed their focus on adolescent mental health, particularly within the context of intergenerational trauma, limited living conditions, and the chronic lack of professional support. Schools expanded counseling services and early intervention programs, and families, especially those with members in tribal law enforcement, faced stricter requirements for safe firearm storage. Nationally, the Red Lake case sparked broader conversations about inequities in mental health care for Native communities, emphasizing the need for sustained investment rather than reactive measures after tragedy strikes. For Red Lake, healing took shape through cultural ceremonies, collective solidarity, and the commitment to honor the victims' memories, serving as a powerful reminder of how vital it is to listen to young people whose silent cries for help often go unheard.